A note from Dr. Watson. My friend Sherlock Holmes was one of the cleverest and most important detectives in England some years ago. The police often asked him to help them. My name is Dr. Watson, and I helped Holmes with many of his cases. I kept careful notes and wrote about them. In 1891, Holmes and I had to leave England on a very dangerous case. While we were away, Holmes disappeared. Everyone thought that he was dead. I was very sad at the news. Then, one day in 1894, Holmes returned to England. He was not dead. At first, this was a secret, because he was working on another case. But when the case was finished, we were able to work together again. Holmes was now a better detective than ever before. This little book is called The Return of Sherlock Holmes. The stories come from my notes of the cases that we worked on after his return. 3 of the best cases are here: the 6 Napoleons, the Norwood Builder, and the Golden Glasses. I hope you will enjoy reading them. The 6 Napoleons. Mr. Lestrade, a detective from Scotland Yard, often visited my friend Sherlock Holmes and me in the evening. Holmes enjoyed talking to Lestrade because he learned useful facts about Scotland Yard, London's most important police station. Lestrade liked these visits too, because Holmes was a good detective. Holmes always listened carefully if Lestrade had a difficult case. He often helped Lestrade. On one of these evening visits, Lestrade talked about the weather and other uninteresting things for a long time. Then he stopped talking and sat quietly. Holmes was interested in his silence. "Have you got a good case for me today?" he asked. "Oh, nothing important, Mr. Holmes," said the detective. Holmes laughed. "Please, tell me about it," he said. "Well, Mr. Holmes, there is something, but it doesn't seem very important. I don't want to trouble you with it. I know you like difficult problems, but I think that this will perhaps interest Dr. Watson more than you." I was surprised when Lestrade said this. I like helping Sherlock Holmes with his detective work, but I am really a doctor, not a detective. So I said, "What's the matter? Is somebody ill?" "Yes, I think so. I think that somebody is very ill," was Lestrade's answer. "I think that he is completely mad. Someone is stealing cheap busts of Napoleon Bonaparte and breaking them. I think he hates Napoleon. 4 days ago, he went into a shop in Kennington Road. The owner's name is Morse Hudson, and he sells pictures and other works of art. When the shop assistant was busy, the madman ran in. He picked up a bust of Napoleon, broke it into pieces, and then ran away. Nobody saw his face." "Why are you so interested in this?" said Holmes. "Because he's done it again," replied Lestrade. "Yesterday he got into the house of a doctor, Dr. Barnicot. This doctor is very interested in Napoleon. He lives near Morse Hudson's shop, and he bought 2 busts there. He kept one bust at home and the other in his office, 2 miles away. The thief took the bust from his home and broke it against the garden wall. Dr. Barnicot found it when he got up in the morning. He then went to his office at about 12 o'clock. To his surprise, the second bust was broken too. The pieces were all over the room. "This is more interesting," said Holmes. "Now, please tell me, were these 3 busts exactly the same?" "Yes, they were." "Well," said Holmes, "why did the man choose these 3 busts? I'm sure that there are hundreds of other busts in London." "I think the thief was only interested in the busts, not in Napoleon." "That's possible," Lestrade replied. "But can we be sure? There is no other shop that sells busts in that part of London. Perhaps the madman lives in that area and began with the nearest busts. What do you think, Dr. Watson? Can someone hate Napoleon so much?" "Yes, it's possible," I said, and I told them some interesting examples from the history of medicine. "But," I said, "how did this madman know where these 3 busts were?" "It's very interesting," said Sherlock Holmes. "Please tell us, Mr. Lestrade, if you learn more." Next morning, I was dressing when Holmes came into my room. "Lestrade wants to see us immediately," he said. "He's at a house in Kensington." I quickly finished dressing. We had a cup of coffee, then we went to Kensington. The house was in a quiet street, but it was not far from the busy centre of London. That morning there was a large crowd of people standing outside. Lestrade was waiting for us. He was looking very serious. I noticed that there was a lot of blood outside the front door of the house. Lestrade told us to come inside. There we met Horace Harker, the man who lived there. He worked for a newspaper, and today he had a good story, but he could not write about it. He was too frightened. "Please tell us what you know, Mr. Harker," said Lestrade. "I was woken by a loud cry at about 3 o'clock this morning," he said. "I was very frightened, but I went downstairs. There was nobody in the room, but the window was open, and my bust of Napoleon was not there. So I opened the front door to call a policeman. I found a dead man lying there. He was covered in blood. I felt very sick." "Who is the dead man?" asked Holmes. "We don't know," Lestrade answered. "He had a cheap street map of London and a photograph of a very ugly man in his pockets. There was a small knife near him, but I don't know if he was killed with that knife." "What about the bust of Napoleon?" asked Holmes. "We found it quite near here, in the garden of an empty house," said Lestrade. "It was broken, like the others." Lestrade took us to look at the broken bust. Mr. Harker stayed at home. He was beginning to feel better, and he wanted to write the story for his newspaper. We soon arrived at the empty house. The pieces of the bust were lying in the grass by the garden wall. Holmes picked up some pieces and looked at them carefully. "What do you think?" said Lestrade. Holmes looked at him. "There's a lot more work for us to do," he said, "but there are some interesting questions here that we must think about. For example, why did a man kill someone for a cheap bust like this? And if he only wanted to break the bust, why didn't he break it at Mr. Harker's house? Why did he take it away with him?" "Maybe he carried it away because he didn't want Mr. Harker to hear him," said Lestrade. "Perhaps that's the reason," said Holmes. "But why did he bring it to this house and not another one?" "Because this house was empty," replied Lestrade. "But there's another empty house in this road, nearer to Mr. Harker's house. Why didn't he break it there?" "I really don't know," replied Lestrade. Holmes pointed to the streetlight above our heads. He could see what he was doing here. The garden of the other house was too dark. "That's true," said the detective. Then he asked, "But how does this help us, Mr. Holmes?" "I don't know yet," my friend answered, "but I'm going to think about it. What are you going to do next, Mr. Lestrade?" "I want to find out who the dead man was. I need to know why he was in Kensington last night. Then I'll know who killed him outside Mr. Harker's house. Isn't that a good idea?" "Perhaps," replied Sherlock Holmes, "but it isn't my way." "So, what are you going to do?" asked Lestrade. "I'll do things in my way, and you can do things in your way," said Sherlock Holmes. "Then we can talk about the case together later." Then he added something surprising. "If you see Mr. Harker, please tell him this. I'm sure that a dangerous, Napoleon-hating madman was in his house last night." Lestrade was surprised. "Do you really think that's true?" Holmes laughed. "Not really," he said, "but I think the readers of Mr. Harker's newspaper will be interested. We must go now, but please visit us in our rooms in Baker Street at 6 o'clock this evening. Until then, can I keep the photograph that the dead man had with him? After you come to Baker Street, you must come out somewhere with me. Goodbye, and good luck." Mr. Harker's bust was from Harding Brothers' shop in the High Street, so Sherlock Holmes and I walked there together. Mr. Harding was not there. Holmes was not pleased by this. "We'll come back in the afternoon," he said to Mr. Harding's assistant. "And now, Watson, let's visit Mr. Morse Hudson's shop. Dr. Barnicot bought his busts there." Morse Hudson was very angry about the broken busts, but he answered all Holmes's questions. "The busts were made by Gelder and Company in another part of London," he told us. "I can't give you more help than that." But when Holmes showed him the photograph from the dead man's pocket, he cried, "That's Beppo!" "Who's Beppo?" asked Holmes. "He's an Italian. He worked in my shop for a time.
a useful man, but he left last week. I don't know where he went. He left 2 days before the bust was broken."
We thanked Morse Hudson and left his shop. Holmes was quite pleased with what the shopkeeper told us. He decided next to visit Gelder and Company, the factory where the busts were made. We passed through many parts of London, rich places and poor places, before we came to Stepney. Stepney was a rich place in the past, but now poor working people lived there. Many of them came from other countries. We soon found Gelder and Company. We spoke to a German.
"In the past, we made hundreds of busts," he told us. "But this year, we only made 6. 3 were sold to Morse Hudson, and 3 to Harding. The busts were cheaply made, usually by Italian workers."
When Holmes showed him the photograph of the ugly Italian, he became angry.
"That's a very bad man," he said. "His name is Beppo, and he worked here for me. But that was more than a year ago."
"Why did he leave?" Holmes asked.
"He tried to kill another Italian with a knife in the street," replied the German. "The police followed him here and caught him. The other Italian didn't die, so Beppo was only sent to prison for a year. One of his friends works here now. Do you want to speak to him?"
No, said Holmes. "Please, don't tell him anything. This is very important."
"All right,"
the man said. "I have one more question," said Holmes. "It says here, in your book, that you sold the busts on the 3rd of June last year. When did the police come for Beppo? Can you remember?"
"Yes, I can. I paid Beppo for the last time on the 20th of May last year, and it was very soon after that."
"You've helped me a lot," said Holmes. "I must go now. Remember, don't say anything to Beppo's friend." It was late in the afternoon, and we were hungry, so we stopped to have some food in a restaurant. Holmes bought a newspaper. In it was an exciting story by Mr. Harker about the madman who hated Napoleon. Most of the story was not true, but Holmes laughed a lot. He thought it was a good joke. "This is very helpful, Watson," he said. I did not really understand what he meant, but I laughed too at the silly story. After our meal, we went to Harding Brothers. Mr. Harding was a busy little man, and he answered our questions quickly and clearly. His 3 busts were all sold, 1 to Mr. Harker of Kensington, 1 to a Mr. Josiah Brown of Chiswick, and the 3rd to a Mr. Sandeford. Mr. Sandeford lived outside London, in Reading. Holmes seemed very interested in these facts, and thanked Mr. Harding. It was late, so we hurried back to Baker Street. We had to meet Lestrade. Lestrade was waiting for us when we arrived. He was very pleased with himself.
"Have you found out anything, Mr. Holmes?" he asked.
"Well, we know a lot about the busts now," replied Holmes.
"The busts?"
said Lestrade, and laughed.
"I know you're a clever detective, Mr. Holmes, but I think I've found out something more important than that."
"What have you discovered?"
"I now know who the dead man was, and I think I've found the motive for his murder,"
was Lestrade's reply. "Very good, Mr. Lestrade." Holmes smiled and waited. Lestrade continued.
"We have a detective at Scotland Yard who knows many of the Italians in London. He knew this man well. His name was Pietro Vannucci, a thief and a very dangerous man. Vannucci worked for the Mafia. He punished people who broke the rules of the Mafia. That was his job. Usually he killed them. I think the man in the photograph broke the rules. Vannucci was following him. They had a fight, and Vannucci was killed."
Holmes smiled and said, "Very good, Mr. Lestrade, very good. But I still don't understand why the busts were broken." Lestrade almost shouted at Holmes.
"Those busts aren't important. Can't you forget them, Mr. Holmes? A man will only go to prison for 6 months for breaking busts. Pietro Vannucci is dead. That's what interests me."
"I see," said Holmes quietly. "What are you going to do next, Mr. Lestrade?"
"I'm going to go to the area of London where the Italians live. I want to find the man in the photograph. Do you want to come with me?"
Holmes did not seem very interested. "No, thank you. I think that we can find him more easily in another place tonight."
"Really? Where?"
"At an address in Chiswick. If you come with me tonight, I will go with you tomorrow," said Holmes. Lestrade was surprised, but he agreed. The three of us had an early dinner together. Then Holmes told Lestrade and me to rest until 11 o'clock. Holmes did not rest. He spent the time in his room looking at some old newspapers. He was, I thought, probably looking for some facts about Vannucci or Beppo. Lestrade and I woke up at 10:30. Holmes was waiting for us. He told me to bring my gun. I noticed that he took his favourite strong walking stick with him. We quickly drove to Chiswick, and Holmes took us to a large house in a dark street. The house, too, was dark and quiet. The people inside were probably already asleep in bed. "I'm glad that it's not raining," said Holmes quietly. "It's possible that we'll have to wait a long time. We mustn't smoke, and we must be very quiet. I hope we're going to discover something tonight." We only had to wait for 5 minutes. The garden gate suddenly opened, and a man ran quickly down the garden path towards the house. We could not see his face. It was too dark, and he was moving too quickly. He disappeared into the darkness, and we waited in silence. Next, we heard the sound of a window opening very slowly. Then we saw a small light inside the front room of the house.
"Let's go to the open window. Then we can catch him as he comes out," said Lestrade.
But before we moved, the man came outside again. He was carrying something. He looked around him. He saw that nobody was watching him. Then there was a sudden crash as he broke the thing against the wall. We ran forward. Holmes jumped on his back, and the man fell heavily to the ground. Lestrade and I quickly went to help Holmes. I had my gun ready. Soon the man was our prisoner. He looked up at us. His face was very ugly. We could see that he was surprised and angry. I realized immediately that he was the man in the photograph. While we were holding the man on the ground, Holmes was looking at the broken pieces of another bust of Napoleon. He lifted up each piece and looked at it in the light. Somebody turned on the lights in the house. Then a short, fat man in a shirt and trousers came out towards Holmes.
"You're Mr. Sherlock Holmes, aren't you?"
he asked, with a smile on his face. "That's correct," said Holmes. "And you are Mr. Josiah Brown."
"Yes, sir. We did what you told us. We locked the doors to the house and turned off the lights. Then we waited very quietly. You've done very well. Please, come inside and have some food and drink."
Holmes thanked Mr. Brown, but Lestrade wanted to take the man away, so we all drove to Scotland Yard. The thief said nothing, but he looked at us all the time. His ugly white face was like an animal's. When we arrived at Scotland Yard, the man was searched. He had nothing with him except a long knife with dry blood on it and a little money. As we were leaving, Lestrade said, "Well, Mr. Holmes, I must thank you for all your help. My ideas were correct. Don't you agree?" Holmes smiled and said, "It's a little late at night now for me to explain, but I think the business of the busts is very important. It's much more important than you think. Can you come and see me again at 6 o'clock tomorrow evening?" "Of course," said Lestrade. "I'm always happy to visit you. I'll be pleased to come." As we were going home, Holmes said to me, "Lestrade is a good detective, but he doesn't understand everything about this case. I think this is a very unusual case, Watson." "Really?" I said. "Is there more to explain?" "The busts, Watson. I think they're the most important part of this case." At 6 o'clock the next evening, Lestrade came to Baker Street to see us. He now knew more about Beppo. The Italian was a well-known thief. He spent time in prison after he knifed a man. We already knew that. Beppo was, Lestrade said, very good at making busts and other works of art. It was possible that Beppo made the busts of Napoleon at Gelder and Company. Holmes listened to Lestrade's words with a smile on his face, but I could see that he really wanted to tell Lestrade something. I was sure that it was something very surprising. There was a knock on the door, and the servant brought an old man into the room. He had a red face, and he was carrying a large bag. He put the bag on the table.
"Is Mr. Sherlock Holmes here?"
he asked. Holmes smiled and said, "I'm Sherlock Holmes, and I think that you're Mr. Sandeford of Reading. I'm pleased to meet you. This is my friend, Dr. Watson, and this is Mr. Lestrade from Scotland Yard. We both said hello to Mr. Sandford.
"I have the bust of Napoleon for you,"
he told Holmes. He also had a letter.
"Mr. Holmes sent me this letter yesterday,"
he said to Lestrade and me. He read it to us.
"Dear Mr. Sandford, I know from Mr. Harding that you bought the last bust of Napoleon in his shop. I want that bust very much, and I will pay £10 for it. Please bring it to my rooms in Baker Street, London, tomorrow at 6:30. Sherlock Holmes."
Then he said to Holmes,
"Do you know how much I paid for the bust in this bag?"
"No, I don't," said Holmes.
"Well, I'm not a thief, Mr. Holmes. You should know that I only paid £1 for it. If you don't want to buy it now, I'll understand."
"No," said Holmes. "I still want the bust. Here's £10. He gave the money to Mr. Sandford.
"Thank you very much,"
said Mr. Sandford. He took the money and opened the bag. Inside was an ordinary white bust of Napoleon, just like the others. Holmes said, "Thank you, Mr. Sandford. Now, before you go, I want you to sign this piece of paper. It says that you sold the bust to me for £10.
"Oh, of course,"
said Mr. Sandford. He signed the note and left. Holmes watched Mr. Sandford leave. Then he took a clean white cloth from a cupboard and put it on the table. Lestrade and I watched him carefully. He put the bust carefully on the cloth. Then he took his stick and hit the bust hard. It broke into small pieces. Holmes shouted with excitement and picked up something small and black from the cloth. Lestrade and I were silent.
"This is the black pearl of the Borgias," said Holmes.
We were both very surprised.
"Really, Holmes?" I cried. "How did you know that it was there?"
"It's impossible," said Lestrade quietly. Holmes explained. "This is the most famous pearl in the world. It was stolen from the hotel room of the Princess of Colonna on the 22nd of May last year. I'm sure that you remember that, Mr. Lestrade."
"Yes, I do,"
replied Lestrade. "Well," Holmes continued, "you will also remember where the hotel was. The Princess was staying in the same part of London as Gelder and Company. The police thought that the thief was an Italian servant in the hotel, Lucretia Venucci, but they never proved it. I think that her brother, Pietro, was killed 2 nights ago. When I looked at my old newspapers, I discovered something. Beppo was caught only 2 days after the pearl was stolen. The busts were made in those 2 days. Perhaps the Venuccis stole the pearl from the hotel, and Beppo stole it from them. I don't know exactly, but it doesn't matter. I am sure now that Beppo had the pearl with him on the night of his street fight. He ran away, and the police followed him. Beppo ran to Gelder's and wanted to hide the pearl. But where? He didn't have much time. He saw the new white busts of Napoleon drying on the table. They were still soft, so he pushed the pearl into one of them. Then he covered the hole. It was the perfect place to hide the pearl. Because of the street fight, Beppo was sent to prison for a year. During that time, the 6 busts were sold. But we know that Beppo's friend still worked at Gelder's. I think that Beppo asked him to find the names of the buyers of the busts. So when Beppo came out of prison, he started looking for the bust with the pearl in it. He got a job with Morse Hudson. There he learned where the first 3 busts were. Then he left the job, returned and broke the first bust. Next, he broke Dr. Barnicot's busts. But he didn't find what he was looking for. The other 3 busts were sold to Mr. Harding's shop. Beppo found out who had them. I'm not sure how he did that. Perhaps an Italian friend was working there. At the same time, Vannucci knew that Beppo was out of prison. He wanted to find him. He was sure that Beppo knew the pearl's hiding place. Vannucci was following Beppo when he went to Mr. Harker's house in Kensington. They fought, and Beppo killed Vannucci. But, I asked, if Vannucci knew Beppo well, why did he carry his photograph? To show to other people, replied Holmes. Of course, he continued, I wasn't sure that Beppo didn't find the pearl in Mr. Harker's bust. But if he didn't, there were only 2 more busts. One was in Chiswick, and the other one was in Reading. Chiswick is much nearer than Reading, so I told Josiah Brown and his family to be ready. We were lucky. Beppo went to Mr. Brown's house first, and we caught him. I knew then that the pearl was in Mr. Sandiford's bust. Mr. Harker's newspaper report helped us. His story made Beppo very happy. The police seemed to have the wrong idea. They were looking for a Napoleon-hating madman. He didn't think that anyone knew the true secret of the busts. But when I heard the name Vannucci, I immediately thought of the missing black pearl. "Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, "I've seen your work on many cases in the past, but this is one of the best. I'm sure that my friends at Scotland Yard will be very interested in the case. They will also be interested in the way that you've solved it. Can you come and meet them tomorrow? They will be very pleased to talk to you." "I shall be happy to come," said Holmes. "Thank you." "Thank you, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade. "You've helped me to understand this case, and you found the famous black pearl for me." Holmes smiled at the police detective. He didn't know what to say. Then suddenly his face changed. "Well, Watson," he said, "we have to do some work now. This is not our only case. Goodbye, Lestrade. If you have any more little cases for me, please tell me. I'll be happy to help you if I can." The Norwood Builder. "There seem to be no interesting cases these days, Watson," Sherlock Holmes said to me. "London isn't a very interesting place." "I don't think the people of London will agree with you," I answered. He smiled as he pushed his chair back from the breakfast table. "You're right. I mustn't be selfish," he said. It is better for everybody if detectives like me have little work. I smiled too. The world did seem very quiet that morning. Sherlock Holmes sat back in his chair, picked up his newspaper, and started reading. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the front door. I heard the servant open the door. Then somebody ran into the house and up the stairs. He opened our door and stood in front of us. He looked very frightened.
"I'm sorry, Mr. Holmes," he cried. "I must talk to you now. I can't wait. I'm John Hector MacFarlane. I'm sure that you know my name."
"Sit down, Mr. MacFarlane," said Holmes. "No, I don't know your name, but I can see that you're an unmarried lawyer." The man seemed surprised at this, but it didn't surprise me. Holmes was a good detective, and even I noticed the man's untidy clothes and the lawyer's papers in his hand.
"That's true, Mr. Holmes," he replied, "and it's also true that I'm the unhappiest man in London today. Please help me. The police are coming to get me. I'm sure that they followed me here. I'll go with them if you'll help me."
"The police are coming," said Holmes. He looked very happy. I knew that he was hoping for an interesting case. Then he remembered poor Mr. MacFarlane and said, "I'm sorry, Mr. MacFarlane. This seems very interesting. Please tell me more. Why are the police looking for you?"
"They think I killed a man. His name's Jonas Oldacre."
The newspaper was still lying on the table, and our visitor picked it up. I noticed that his hands were shaking.
"Look at your newspaper," he said. "You'll see why I've come to you, Mr. Holmes," he said. "Look at this."
"Fire in Lower Norwood. Rich man disappears. Is he dead? Was he killed?" I took the newspaper and looked at the report. The police, it said, wanted to find Mr. MacFarlane.
"They think I killed Mr. Oldacre for his money," said the poor man. "What will my mother think? What can I do?"
I looked at Mr. MacFarlane carefully. He was a handsome man with fair hair, and he was probably about 27 years old. His clothes showed that he had plenty of money. Then I looked at Sherlock Holmes. His eyes were closed, so I read him the newspaper report. "Late last night or early this morning, there was a fire in Sydenham Road in Lower Norwood. The police are worried about Mr. Jonas Oldacre, the owner of the house. Mr. Oldacre is well known in the area. He made a lot of money as a builder, but has stopped doing building work. He is 62 years old, unmarried, and lives at Deep Dean House. He has few friends. Mr. Oldacre still keeps a lot of old wood at the back of his house. When a fire started there last night, at about 12 o'clock, the wood burned fast. At first, it seemed like an ordinary fire, but then someone noticed that the owner of the house was not there. In one room, there were some important papers on the table and signs of a fight. A stick was found on the floor, and also some blood. Mr. Oldacre had a visitor last night, a lawyer called John Hector MacFarlane. The police think that the stick belongs to him. There are also signs that something heavy was pulled through the grass from the house to the fire, something An animal or a person was burned with the old wood. The police think that Mr. Oldacre was killed in his house. Then he was taken outside and burnt. They are looking for Mr. MacFarlane. Mr. Lestrade of Scotland Yard is working on the case." When I finished reading, Sherlock Holmes opened his eyes. "So why, Mr. MacFarlane, haven't they found you yet?" he asked. "I live with my mother and father at Torrington Lodge, in Blackheath," said Mr. MacFarlane. "But last night I wasn't at home. I stayed at a hotel in Norwood, because my visit to Mr. Oldacre finished very late. The police will try to catch me today. I think they'll come here for me." Suddenly there was another knock on the front door, and we heard policemen's voices. 2 men waited outside, and one joined us upstairs. It was our friend, Lestrade, the detective from Scotland Yard. Lestrade looked straight at MacFarlane and said, "John Hector MacFarlane, you must come with me. We believe that you killed Jonas Oldacre last night." MacFarlane stood up. His face was white. "Sit down," said Holmes. "And, Mr. Lestrade, please sit down too."
"But I must take Mr. MacFarlane away,"
said Lestrade. "Half an hour won't matter to you," replied Holmes. "And Mr. MacFarlane wants to tell us what happened last night."
"Well, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, "because you're my good friend, I'll wait for half an hour, but no more."
"Thank you," said Holmes. Then he asked Mr. MacFarlane to tell us his story. Mr. MacFarlane began. "Yesterday morning I knew nothing about Mr. Oldacre, except his name. He was a friend of my mother and father a long time ago, but not now. I was very surprised when he came to my office yesterday. I'm a lawyer. Mr. Oldacre showed me some papers, his will, which I have here. He asked me to make a good copy of the will. He wanted to wait, so I began the work. I soon saw, to my surprise, that he wanted to give me all his money after his death. I asked him why he wanted to do that. He explained he had no children, but he knew my father, so he wanted me to have the money. Of course, I thanked him for his great kindness, but I was still very surprised. I made the copy as quickly as possible. Finally, it was finished. He asked me to go to his house that evening to see some more important papers. His last words to me were, "Please don't tell your mother and father. I want this to be a surprise for them." Mr. Oldacre was being very kind to me. I wanted to do exactly what he said, so I sent a message to my parents. I had important business after work, I said. I told them not to worry if I did not come home. Mr. Oldacre asked me to be at his house at 9 o'clock, but I couldn't find it. I didn't arrive until 9:30. Mr. Oldacre— "Stop," said Holmes. "Who opened the front door?" "An old woman. I think she worked for Mr. Oldacre." "And did she know your name?" "Yes," replied the young lawyer. "Then she took me into a room. There was a simple meal waiting for me on the table. I ate some of the food, and then Mr. Oldacre came and took me to another room. He had a lot of papers in a cupboard there, and we worked on these together for a long time. We didn't finish until about 11:30. Mr. Oldacre told me to leave quietly by the back door, because the old woman was asleep. When I was leaving, I couldn't find my stick, but Mr. Oldacre said, "That doesn't matter, my boy. You can get it another day. I hope you're going to visit me very often." When I left him, the cupboard was open. The papers were still on the table. I couldn't go back to Blackheath. It was too late. So I stayed at the Annerley Arms in Norwood. I didn't know about all this until I read the paper this morning. Mr. MacFarlane stopped speaking, and Lestrade said,
"Have you any more questions, Mr. Holmes?"
"No. I want to go to Blackheath first," said Holmes.
"Don't you mean Norwood?"
asked Lestrade. "Perhaps I do," replied Holmes, and he smiled at Lestrade. Holmes often understood things more quickly than Lestrade, and the police detective knew this. Lestrade turned to Mr. MacFarlane and said,
"There are 2 policemen waiting for you outside. You must go with them now."
The policeman took Mr. MacFarlane away. His face was still white, and he looked at us sadly, but he said nothing. Lestrade stayed in the room with us after MacFarlane left. Holmes picked up the lawyer's papers and looked at them. Then he passed them to Lestrade. "These are very interesting, aren't they?" he said. Lestrade looked at the papers for a minute, then said,
"I can understand the first few lines perfectly. The writing is good. After that, the writing is very bad, and I can't read it. Later, there are some more good lines. Then the writing is bad again."
"Why do you think it's like that?" asked Holmes.
"Why do you think it's like that?" replied Lestrade.
"The answer is very simple," said Holmes. "Mr. Oldacre wrote this on the train on his way to London. The good parts were written at stations. The bad parts were written when the train was moving." Lestrade laughed and said,
"Very good, Mr. Holmes. But how does that help us with the case?"
"Well," said Holmes, "most people don't write their wills on trains. It seems that this will wasn't really very important to Mr. Oldacre."
"It was very important," said Lestrade. "His will is the reason that he's dead now."
"Do you think that's true?" asked Holmes.
"Don't you?"
replied Lestrade. "It's possible, but the case isn't very clear to me yet."
"Not clear?" said Lestrade. "It's very clear to me. When MacFarlane knew about Mr. Oldacre's will, he went to Norwood. He killed Mr. Oldacre, and then he burned the dead body. It seems very simple to me."
"Too simple," said Holmes. "MacFarlane is not stupid. A clever man doesn't kill a man on the same day that he made his will. And the man's servant knew that MacFarlane was in the house. Does a clever man carefully burn the body and then carelessly leave his stick in the house?"
"You know very well, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, "that a murderer doesn't always think very clearly just after his crime. It's easy to forget something like a stick. Perhaps he was afraid to go back into the house. What other motive is there for Mr. Oldacre's murder?"
"I can think of many possible motives," said Holmes. "Here's an example. A thief was passing the house and saw the 2 men in a room with the papers. He thought that they had money there. When one of the men left, the thief came in through the window. Then he killed the other man.
"Why didn't he take anything?" asked Lestrade.
Because he found only papers. There was no money in the room, said Holmes. Lestrade did not seem very sure of his ideas now, but he said,
"Well, you can look for your thief if you want to, Mr. Holmes, but I think that Macfarlane was Mr. Oldacre's killer. He had a motive. He was also the only person in the world who did not need to take anything from Mr. Oldacre's house. It was already his, in Mr. Oldacre's will."
"I didn't say that you were wrong," replied Sherlock Holmes. "I only wanted to show you that there were other possible motives for Mr. Oldacre's death. And now, goodbye, Mr. Lestrade. I will probably see you at Norwood later today." Lestrade left us, and Holmes put on his coat. "I'm going to Blackheath," he said. "Why not Norwood?" I asked. "Two strange things have happened, my friend, and the police are only thinking about one of them. The first thing was the strange will. Why did Oldacre want to give his money to Mr. Macfarlane? I'm going to find out." "Do you want me to come with you?" I asked. "No, it isn't necessary. You can't help me. There's no danger at Blackheath," replied Holmes.
One Saturday morning, I went to visit my friend Sherlock Holmes, but he already had a visitor. His visitor was a large man with a red face, small eyes, and bright red hair. "I see you're busy, Holmes. I'll come back another time," I said.
"You came at the perfect time, my dear Watson,"
said Holmes warmly. "I thought you were busy," I said.
"I am busy, very busy,"
he replied. "I'll wait in the other room."
"No,"
said Holmes, and he turned to the visitor.
"Dr. Watson helped me in many of my most successful cases, Mr. Wilson. I'm sure he can help me with your case, too."
The large gentleman got up from his chair and said,
"I'm very pleased to meet you, Dr. Watson."
Then we all sat down.
"I know you like unusual, difficult cases, Watson, and this case is very unusual. Mr. Wilson, please tell your story to Dr. Watson."
Mr. Wilson took an old, dirty newspaper out of his pocket and began looking at the advertisements in it. I watched him carefully. From his clothes, I saw that he was an ordinary British shopkeeper. Holmes saw me watching the old man. He smiled and said,
"I see you're trying to be a detective, Watson. Well, it's clear that Mr. Wilson was a workman in the past, and he also lived in China for some time. Recently, he did a lot of writing."
Mr. Wilson was very surprised.
"How do you know all these things, Mr. Holmes?" "You are right. In the past, I was a workman."
"Your hands show it, Mr. Wilson,"
Holmes said.
"Your right hand is bigger than your left. You used your right hand a lot."
"But how did you know that I wrote a lot recently?"
"I looked at the sleeves of your shirt, Mr. Wilson. The material of the right sleeve is much thinner. That shows you were writing at a desk."
"And how did you know that I lived in China?"
You have a tattoo of a pink fish on your right hand. That tattoo is only done in China. You see, I like studying tattoos. And there is a Chinese coin on your watch chain."
Mr. Wilson laughed loudly and said,
"At first I thought you were extremely clever, but perhaps it wasn't so difficult after all."
Holmes looked at me and said,
Sometimes I think that it's better not to explain my methods, dear Watson.
He turned to Mr. Wilson and said,
Did you find the advertisement?
Yes, here it is,
he said, pointing to it with his big red finger. It was an advertisement in the Morning Chronicle of 2 months before. The Red-Headed League. Man needed for new job at League. Pay £4 a week. Work office-based. Job only open to people with red hair. Come to Red-Headed League offices, 7 Pope's Court, Fleet Street, London, at 11 o'clock Monday morning. Duncan Ross. What does it mean? I said, after reading this strange advertisement twice. Holmes laughed happily.
It's very unusual, Watson, isn't it? And now, Mr. Wilson, please tell us everything about yourself, your home, your work, and this Red-Headed League.
Well, I have a shop below my house at Saxe-Coburg Square in London. It isn't a very big business, and I don't make much money now. I only have one assistant in the shop. Luckily, he wants to learn the business, so he accepts half pay.
What is your young assistant's name?
Asked Holmes.
His name is Vincent Spaulding, but he's not very young. He's an excellent worker, and he can make more money in another shop, but he's happy with me.
It's unusual to have an excellent assistant,
said Holmes.
Tell me more about him.
Spaulding loves photography and spends a lot of time in the cellar developing his pictures. He's sometimes in there for hours, but he's a very good worker.
Are there any servants in your home?
There's a young girl. She cooks and cleans the house. She, Spaulding and I, are the only people in the house. My wife is dead, and I have no children. About 2 months ago, Spaulding came into my office with this newspaper in his hand and said, "I'm sorry my hair isn't red." I asked him why, and he said, "Well, with red hair I can get an easy job and make a lot of money. Look at this advertisement. The Red-Headed League is a club for men with red hair, and it's offering a job to men with red hair. You should apply for the job. You have bright red hair." I asked him, "What's the pay?" He said, £4 a week, and you can easily continue working here. Well, Mr. Holmes, £200 a year is very useful to me, so I asked Spaulding for more information. He showed me the advertisement and said, "I've heard that the club's money came from a rich American, Ezekiah Hopkins. He was a strange man with red hair. He died and left all of his money to the Red-Headed League. The money is used to give easy jobs to men with red hair." "But thousands of men have red hair," I said. "I can never get the job." "No, Mr. Wilson," said Spaulding. "The Red-Headed League gives jobs only to people from London. Ezekiah Hopkins was born in London and he loved this city. Also, only men with bright red hair can get these jobs. The club doesn't accept men with dark red hair or light red hair. You can get the job easily." I decided to ask Spaulding to come with me to the Red-Headed League's offices,
said Mr. Wilson.
I closed the shop for the day and we went to Fleet Street. Spaulding was happy to have a holiday. Fleet Street was full of red-haired men, and Pope's Court looked like a basket of oranges. But few men had bright red hair like mine. Spaulding pushed through all the people and we got to the office. There was little furniture, 2 uncomfortable chairs, a kitchen table and a bookcase. A small man with bright red hair sat at the table and spoke to lots of red-headed men. He said no to all of them, and then he talked to me. He was friendly and closed the door of the office behind us. "This is Mr. Jabez Wilson," said my assistant, "and he would like the job in the League."
His hair looks fine,
The man said.
but is it real? We must be careful.
He suddenly took my hair in his hands and pulled it. I cried out because he hurt me.
You have real tears in your eyes. This means your hair is real. Congratulations! The job is yours.
He shook my hand warmly and said,
My name is Duncan Ross, and I am the secretary of the League. When can you begin?
"Well, I have a business already," I said. "Oh, don't worry about that, Mr. Wilson," said my assistant. "I can look after the shop for you." "What are the working hours?" I asked Mr. Ross.
From 10 o'clock in the morning until 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
"You see, Mr. Holmes, I do most of my work in the evening. I could easily work for Mr. Ross in the morning, and I knew Spaulding could look after the business in the morning." "Those hours are fine," I said happily. "What must I do?"
Your job is to copy the Encyclopaedia Britannica. You must bring your own pen, ink and paper, and you must never leave the office until 2 o'clock. Can you start tomorrow?
"Certainly," I answered. The next morning I bought some paper and started working at Pope's Court. Mr. Ross showed me the beginning of the letter A in the encyclopedia, and then he left. Every day I finished work at 2 o'clock. Each week Mr. Ross gave me £4 in gold. This continued for about 8 weeks, and I nearly finished copying the letter A. Then, suddenly, everything ended.
Ended?
Asked Holmes.
Yes, it happened this morning. I went to work at 10 o'clock, but the door was locked. There was a notice on the door that said, "The Red-Headed League does not exist anymore. 9th of October, 1890.
Sherlock Holmes and I started laughing.
"I can't see anything funny.
Said Mr. Wilson angrily.
If you think this is funny, I'll leave."
No, no.
Cried Holmes.
Your case is very unusual, but there is something a bit funny about it. Please, Mr. Wilson, continue.
I asked the people in the building, but no one knew about Mr. Duncan Ross or the Red-Headed League. I was angry and confused.
What did you do then?
Asked Holmes.
I went home to Saxeburg Square and told Spaulding. He was surprised and did not know what to say. So I decided to come to you, Mr. Holmes, because I don't want to lose £4 a week.
This is possibly a very serious case,
Said Holmes.
Of course it's a serious case. I'm losing £4 a week.
You can't be too angry, Mr. Wilson. The League paid you £32 for 8 weeks' work, and you learnt many things about the letter A in the encyclopedia. Now, I'd like to ask you some questions. When did Vincent Spaulding start working for you?
About 3 months ago.
What is he like?
He's small but not thin, and he moves quickly. He's about 30 years old and has a white mark just above his eyes.
Holmes was suddenly excited.
A white mark?
He cried.
And does he have little holes in his ears for earrings?
Yes, he does.
Said Holmes, sitting back in his chair.
Well, Mr. Wilson, I want to think about this case. Today is Saturday. On Monday I'll have an answer. Well, Watson,
said Holmes when our visitor left.
What do you think of this strange case?
I don't know, Holmes. It's very mysterious and confusing.
Yes, I agree,
replied Holmes.
I must work hard on this case.
What are you going to do?
I'm going to smoke my pipe. Please don't speak to me for 50 minutes.
Holmes sat down in his chair, closed his eyes, and started smoking his old black pipe. Holmes is probably sleeping, I thought. But then he suddenly jumped up and put his pipe down on the table.
There is a concert of classical music at St. James's Hall this afternoon,
Holmes said.
Let's go and listen.
Yes, I'm free today, I replied.
Good. Put on your hat and come. I want to have some lunch first.
We went to see Saxe-Coburg Square. It was quite poor and ugly. There was some grass in the middle of the square and old houses around it. One of them had a shop window and shop door, as well as a house door. Outside the shop we saw a sign with the name Jabez Wilson painted in big white letters. This was Mr. Wilson's shop. Holmes stopped and looked at the shop for a moment. Then he stood in front of the shop and hit the large stones of the street with his walking stick. Finally, he knocked on the shop door. A young man opened the door immediately.
Can you tell me the way to the Strand?
Asked Holmes.
3rd right, 4th left,
answered the assistant quickly.
A very clever man,
said Holmes as we walked away. Do you know him? I asked.
No, but I looked at the knees of his trousers.
And what did you see?
What I expected to see.
And why did you hit the stones of the street?
My dear doctor, this is a time for looking, not for talking. Let's go and look at the street behind the square.
We left the square and we were soon in one of the noisiest streets in London. We saw a bakery, a newspaper shop, a restaurant, and an office of the City and Suburban Bank.
We did our work well, Watson,
said Holmes.
Now let's have some lunch and then go to the concert.
Holmes was a very good musician, and he loved concerts. After the concert, he said,
Do you want to go home now, Watson?
Yes, I do, Holmes.
I have many things to do,
he said.
This case at Saxe-Coburg Square is serious. Someone is planning a serious crime, but I think we can stop it. Let's meet tonight.
At what time?
At 10 o'clock.
I'll be at Baker Street at 10.
Good. There will possibly be danger tonight, so bring your gun.
He waved his hand and walked off. I was quite confused about this case, but Holmes, of course, was not. I saw and I heard exactly the same things as Holmes saw and heard, but he seemed to understand everything, and I understood nothing. I thought about it for a long time, but everything was still a mystery to me. When I arrived at 10 o'clock, there were 2 carriages outside the door at Baker Street. 2 visitors were there too, a policeman called Peter Jones, and a tall, thin man with a sad face and dark clothes.
Watson, I think you know Mr. Jones. Let me introduce you to Mr. Merriweather, The director of the City and Suburban Bank. He is going to be part of our adventure tonight. I hope you're right, Mr. Holmes,
said Mr. Merryweather,
because I didn't go to my usual card game with my friends this evening, and I have never missed my card game in 37 years. I think this will be an exciting night, Mr. Merryweather,
said Holmes.
You are going to save £30,000, and you, Jones, are going to catch a terrible criminal.
John Clay, the murderer and bank robber! Exclaimed Jones. He's young, but he's the cleverest and most dangerous criminal in England. His grandfather was a king's brother, and he is an Oxford University man.
It's time to go now,
said Holmes, looking at his watch.
Mr. Merryweather, please go with Mr. Jones in the first carriage, and Watson and I will follow you in the second one.
During the journey, Holmes spoke very little, but he sang some of the music from the concert that afternoon. Finally, the two carriages arrived at the City and Suburban Bank in the main street near Saxe-Coburg Square. Mr. Merryweather took his keys and opened a side door of the bank. We went through many doors and dark corridors. Then he took a lamp and we went to a big cellar. There was a strong smell of earth, and there were a lot of big boxes on the cellar floor.
The ceiling looks strong,
said Holmes, holding up the lamp.
The floor is strong too,
said Merryweather, hitting it with his stick.
Oh dear, it sounds empty. Please speak quietly,
said Holmes.
The thieves must not hear us. Please sit down on one of those boxes and don't say or do anything.
Mr. Merryweather sat down silently. Holmes put the lamp on the floor and took out a magnifying glass from his pocket. He carefully looked at the cracks between the large stones of the floor.
We probably have one more hour,
said Holmes.
The thieves can't do anything until Mr. Wilson is in bed. Then they'll work very quickly. Well, Watson, I'm sure you understand that we're in the cellar of one of London's biggest banks. Mr. Merryweather is the director of the bank, and he'll explain the situation to you. You see, Dr. Watson, it's our French gold,
the director said very quietly.
Inside these big boxes there are £30,000 in gold coins. That is why the worst criminals are interested in this cellar. Gentlemen, now we must wait in the dark,
said Holmes, turning off the lamp. Suddenly, everything was black.
They will soon be here,
he continued,
so we must hide behind the boxes. When they come, we must be ready to act quickly. These are dangerous men. If they shoot at us, Watson, you must shoot at them.
I put my gun on top of a box, and I was ready to shoot.
There is only one way for them to escape,
Holmes continued.
Through Wilson's house and into Saxe-Coburg Square. Did you do what I asked, Jones?
Yes, Mr. Holmes. 3 policemen are waiting outside Mr. Wilson's house, said Jones.
Very good. Now we must be silent and wait,
said Holmes. We waited for an hour and a quarter, but in the dark it seemed much longer. My legs and arms were tired. Suddenly, I saw some light through the cracks in the floor. Someone pushed up a big stone, and a white hand appeared. The light became brighter, and a face appeared. It was Mr. Wilson's assistant. The young man looked around and then climbed up into the cellar. He helped another man to climb out of the hole. Both men were small, and the other man had bright red hair. Holmes ran forward and caught Mr. Wilson's assistant.
"Jump down the hole again, Archie,"
cried the assistant. The other man climbed down quickly. Mr. Wilson's assistant had a gun in his hand, but Holmes hit it to the floor with his stick.
"You don't have a chance, John Clay,"
said Holmes.
"I know, but my friend escaped."
"There are 3 policemen waiting for your friend outside Mr. Wilson's house,"
said Holmes, smiling.
"Oh, really?"
John Clay answered calmly.
"You did everything perfectly. Well done, Mr. Holmes."
"Well done to you,"
Holmes answered.
"Your idea of the Red-Headed League was new and unusual."
"Give me your hands," said Jones to Clay. "I'm going to put handcuffs on you now,"
"Don't touch me with your dirty hands,"
cried Clay.
"I am the grandson of a king's brother. You must say 'sir' and 'please' to me."
"All right, sir," said Jones, smiling. "Please come upstairs with me, sir. We can call a carriage, sir, and take you to the police station."
"That's better,"
said Clay. He smiled to the 3 of us and walked away quietly with Jones.
"I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Holmes,"
said Mr. Merriweather.
"This was certainly an exciting night. You stopped one of the biggest bank robberies in history. This was a very interesting case, and I enjoyed it,"
said Holmes. In the early hours of the morning, Holmes and I returned to Baker Street.
"You see, Watson,"
Holmes said, drinking his cup of tea,
"the reason for the Red-Headed League was very simple. Clay and his friend Duncan Ross wanted to get Mr. Wilson away from his shop for several hours every day."
"But how did you know that they were planning a bank robbery?" I asked.
"Well, Watson, I thought of the assistant's hobby, photography. We knew that the young man spent a lot of time in the cellar developing his pictures. Mr. Wilson described Vincent Spaulding to me, and I knew immediately that he was John Clay, the famous bank robber. Clay was doing something in Mr. Wilson's cellar. He was in the cellar for several hours a day for many weeks. And what was he doing? He was digging a tunnel to another building. You were surprised when I hit the stones in Saxe-Coburg Square with my stick. Well, I wanted to know if the tunnel was in front of the house or behind it. Then I rang the bell. I didn't go into the shop because I only wanted to see Spaulding's trousers. The knees of his trousers were dirty with brown earth. When I discovered that the City and Suburban Bank was behind Mr. Wilson's house, I suddenly understood everything.
"But how did you know that the robbery was tonight?" I asked him.
My dear Watson, they closed the League office because they weren't interested in Mr. Wilson's work anymore. So I knew the tunnel was finished, and they had to use it soon. Saturday night was the best time for them because no one could discover the robbery until Monday morning. So I knew the robbery was tonight.
"You solved this mysterious case beautifully, Holmes," I said.
Thank you, Watson. Well, at least this case wasn't boring.
I visited my friend Sherlock Holmes on the second morning of Christmas. When I arrived, he was sitting in front of the fire, wearing his purple dressing gown. Next to the sofa was a wooden chair, and on the chair was a dirty old hat. A magnifying glass and a forceps were on the chair, so the hat was probably part of one of Holmes's investigations. "You are busy," I said. "Perhaps I interrupt you."
"Not at all,"
he replied, and indicated the hat.
"The problem is very simple, but it is still interesting and maybe even instructive."
I sat down in an armchair and warmed my hands in front of the fire because it was very cold outside. "I imagine," I said, "that this hat is connected with a terrible crime."
No crime,"
said Sherlock Holmes, laughing.
"It is only one of those strange things that happens when 4 million human beings live within the small area of a city. With so many people, every imaginable combination of events is possible, and sometimes you can find a problem that is striking and strange, but not criminal. Do you know Peterson, the commissionaire?"
"Yes."
"This trophy belongs to him."
"It is his hat?"
No. He found it. Its owner is unknown. Look at it carefully, and not as a dirty old hat, but as an intellectual problem. It arrived here on Christmas morning, together with a good fat goose. That goose is probably cooking at Peterson's house at this very moment. These are the facts. About 4 o'clock on Christmas morning, Peterson was returning from a party along Tottenham Court Road. In front of him, he saw a tall man carrying a white goose. Then he saw some men attack the tall man. One of the attackers knocked his hat off, so the man lifted his walking stick to defend himself. But when he lifted the stick, he broke a shop window by mistake. Peterson ran to help the man, but when the man saw Peterson with his commissionaire uniform, he thought he was a policeman, and he ran away, and so did the attackers. Peterson was there all alone, with the hat and the goose.
"Of course, Peterson then returned the goose to its owner," I said.
"No,"
replied Holmes.
"that is the problem. It is true that for Mrs. Henry Baker was written on a small card attached to the leg of the goose, and that the initials H.B. are written on the lining of the hat. But there are thousands of Bakers and hundreds of Henry Bakers in London."
"What then did Peterson do?"
"He brought both the goose and the hat to me on Christmas morning, because he knows that I am interested in even the smallest problems. I kept the goose until this morning, and then I gave it to Peterson to cook for dinner."
"Did the man who lost the goose put a notice in the newspaper?"
"No."
"Then how can you discover who he is?" I asked.
"From his hat,"
replied Holmes. "You are joking. What can you learn from this dirty old hat?"
"Here is my magnifying glass,"
replied Holmes.
"You know my methods. Look at the hat and see what you can discover about the identity of the man."
I picked up the hat and looked at it carefully. It was a very ordinary, round, black hat. It was very worn, and inside I could see the initials H.B. There was a hole in the brim for the hat securer, but the elastic was missing. It was very dusty and spotted in several places, but the owner had tried to cover these spots with black ink. "I can see nothing," I said, and gave the hat to Holmes.
"On the contrary, Watson, you can see everything, but you do not reason with what you see."
"Then please tell me what you can deduce from this hat," I said.
"Well,"
said Holmes, as he looked at the hat carefully,
"I can see that the man was highly intellectual. and that 3 years ago he had enough money, but recently he has had difficulties with money. He had foresight in the past, but much less now, which means he has some problem, probably drink. This is probably the reason why his wife has stopped loving him.
My dear Holmes,
He has, however, kept some self-respect,
continued Holmes.
He stays at home and goes out very little. He is totally out of training, is middle-aged, has grey hair which has been recently cut, and he uses lime cream. These are the main facts. Also, I do not think he has gas lighting in his house.
You are certainly joking, Holmes.
Not at all. Don't you understand how I inferred these things?
I am certain that I am very stupid, I replied, but I can't follow your reasoning. For example, how did you deduce that this man was an intellectual? To answer me, Holmes put the hat on his head. The hat was too big for him and covered his eyes.
It's a question of volume,
said Holmes.
If a man has such a big brain, he must have something in it.
How do you know he has less money now than in the past?
This kind of hat first came out 3 years ago. It is a hat of the very best quality. If this man had enough money to buy such an expensive hat 3 years ago, but he has not bought another hat since then it is clear that he has much less money now.
Well, that is clear enough, certainly. But how about the foresight? Sherlock Holmes laughed.
Here is the foresight,
he said, pointing at the hat securer.
Hat securers are never sold with hats. This means that he ordered it, which is a certain sign of foresight. But since he has not replaced the broken elastic, this means that he has less foresight than before. But he has tried to hide some of the spots on his hat with ink, which means he has not completely lost his self-respect.
Your reasoning is certainly very good, I said.
That he is middle-aged, that his hair is grey, that his hair has been recently cut, and that he uses lime cream can all be seen by looking closely at the inside of the hat. With the magnifying glass you can see the partially grey hairs cut by a barber's scissors. They stick to the hat, and there is the distinct odour of lime cream. Also, you will observe that the dust on the hat is the soft brown dust you find in houses, not the hard grey dust you find in the streets. This means that the hat is kept inside the house most of the time, and that he doesn't go out very often. Also, you can see the sweat stain on the inside of the hat, which means he perspired a lot. A man who perspires so much can't be in the best of training.
But his wife? You said that she stopped loving him.
This hat has not been brushed for weeks. When a man's wife lets him go out in such bad condition, it means that she doesn't love him anymore.
But he could be a bachelor, I said.
No, he was bringing the goose to make peace with his wife. Do you remember the card on its leg?
You have an answer for everything. But how did you deduce that he doesn't have gas lighting in his house?
Well, if you saw 1 or 2 wax stains on a hat, it could be by chance. But I can see at least 5 on this hat, which means that this man must use candles very frequently.
Well, it is very ingenious, I said, laughing. But since a crime has not been committed, all this seems to be a waste of time. Sherlock Holmes had opened his mouth to reply when the door opened and Peterson, the commissionaire, rushed in. He looked incredibly shocked.
"The goose, Mr. Holmes! The goose, sir!"
he cried.
What? Has it returned to life and flown out of your kitchen window?
Said Holmes.
Look here, sir. Look what my wife found in its stomach.
He showed us a shiny blue stone in his hand.
By Jove, Peterson,
said Holmes.
this is a treasure. Do you know what you have got?
A diamond, sir. A precious stone. It cuts glass like butter.
It is more than a precious stone. It's the precious stone.
Not the Countess of Morcar's blue carbuncle that was stolen, I cried.
Precisely so,
responded Holmes.
And here is the newspaper article that tells the story. Hotel Cosmopolitan jewel robbery. John Horner, a 26-year-old plumber, has been arrested for stealing the famous blue carbuncle from the Countess of Morcar. James Ryder, an attendant at the hotel, said that he had sent Horner to the Countess's room on the day of the robbery to repair a bar of the grate. Ryder said that he stayed with Horner for a few minutes, but then he had to leave. When Ryder returned, he saw that somebody had forced open the Countess's bureau. Ryder called the police, and the police arrested Horner that same evening. Catherine Cusack, the Countess's maid, said that she heard Ryder call for help. She ran into the room and saw the same things that Ryder described to the police. In addition, the police discovered that Horner had already been charged with robbery in the past, but Horner says that in this case he is innocent. His trial will be soon. So much for the police report,
said Holmes, throwing the paper on a chair.
You see, Watson, our little deductions about the hat have become much more important and less innocent. Here is the stone. The stone came from the goose, and the goose came from Mr. Henry Baker, the gentleman with the bad hat which we examined so carefully. Now we must discover Mr. Baker's part in this mystery. To find him, the simplest thing is to put an advertisement in the evening newspaper.
What will you say? I asked.
Well,
said Holmes.
Found at the corner of Goodge Street, a goose and a black hat. Mr. Henry Baker can have them if he comes to 221B Baker Street at 6:30 this evening.
Then Holmes sent Peterson to buy another goose to give to Baker if he came, and to put the advertisement in all the newspapers. I left to work for the day. That evening, when I returned, I saw a tall man wearing a Scotch hat waiting outside Holmes's house. We entered together.
Mr. Henry Baker, I believe,
said Holmes when he saw us.
Please sit by the fire and get warm. Ah, Watson, you have come at the right time. Is that your hat, Mr. Baker?
Yes, sir. That is certainly my hat.
We have kept your things,
said Holmes,
but we had to eat the goose.
You ate it?
said our visitor with excitement.
Yes, it was going to go bad. But I bought you another goose. It is over there, and I think it is just as good.
Oh, certainly, certainly,
answered Mr. Baker with relief.
Of course,
said Holmes.
We have the feathers, legs, and stomach of your bird, if you want them.
The man laughed loudly.
Perhaps I could keep them to remember my adventure, but no, I don't need them. Thank you, but I will take this goose and go.
There is your hat, then, and there is your bird,
said Holmes.
By the way, could you tell me where you got your goose from? It was a splendid bird, and I would like to get another one like it.
Certainly, sir,
said Mr. Baker.
I got it at the Alpha Inn near the museum. You see, the owner of the inn, Mr. Windigate, started a goose club. Each week we gave him a few pence, and then at Christmas we received a goose."
After this, Mr. Henry Baker picked up his hat and goose and left.
"So much for Mr. Henry Baker,"
said Holmes when Baker had gone. We decided to go immediately to the Alpha Inn to investigate the goose. At the Alpha Inn, we discovered that the goose had come from a salesman called Mr. Breckinridge in Covent Garden. So, once again, Holmes and I put on our coats and walked to Covent Garden to talk to Mr. Breckinridge.
"Remember,"
said Holmes as we walked to Covent Garden,
"at one end of this chain of events we have a simple goose. But at the other end of the chain there is a man who will go to prison for 7 years if we cannot show that he is innocent."
We soon found Mr. Breckinridge's stall, and Holmes asked him about his geese. I was surprised when Mr. Breckinridge replied angrily to Holmes's questions.
"I have had enough. I am tired of people asking me, where are the geese, and who did you sell the geese to, and how much money do you want for the geese? Enough!"
With a little bit of difficulty, Holmes finally got the information we needed. The geese had come from Mrs. Oakshott, 117 Brixton Road. We were walking away when we heard shouting from Mr. Breckinridge's stall. We turned round and saw a little man in front of the stall.
"I've had enough of you and your geese. If you come here again, my dog will attack you,"
shouted Mr. Breckinridge at the little man. The little man started walking away, and Holmes and I went after him. Holmes put his hand on the man's shoulder. The little man turned around and looked frightened. He said,
"Who are you? What do you want?"
"Excuse me,"
said Holmes,
"but I heard you talking to the goose salesman, and I think I can help you."
"You? Who are you? How could you know anything about the matter?"
"My name is Sherlock Holmes. It is my business to know what other people don't know."
"But do you know anything about this?"
"Excuse me, I know everything about this. You are trying to find some geese, which were sold by Mrs. Oakshott of Brixton Road to a salesman called Breckinridge, who then sold them to Mr. Windigate at the Alpha Inn, who then gave one of them to a member of his goose club called Mr. Henry Baker."
"You are the man I wanted to meet,"
said the little man, whose name, as we then discovered, was John Ryder. Yes, John Ryder, the man who had called the police to report the stolen blue carbuncle. We then returned to Holmes's house to discuss the matter in front of a warm fire.
"Here we are,"
said Holmes happily as we entered his room.
"Now, do you want to know what happened to those geese?"
"Yes, sir,"
replied Ryder.
"But you really want to know what happened to that goose, the white one, with a black bar across its tail?"
Ryder shook with emotion.
"Oh, sir,"
he cried.
"where did it go?"
"It came here."
"Here?"
"Yes, and it was an incredible bird. I'm not surprised that you want to find that goose. It laid an egg after it died, the brightest little blue egg that you have ever seen. I have it here in my museum."
Our visitor stood up and then almost fell down. Holmes took out the blue carbuncle, and Ryder stared at it. He did not know if he should say it was his or not.
"The game is up, Ryder. I know almost exactly what happened. Because you worked at the Hotel Cosmopolitan, you knew that the Countess of Morcar had the blue carbuncle in her room."
"It was the Countess's maid, Catherine Cusack, who told me about it."
"I see,"
continued Holmes.
"So you and Catherine Cusack broke the grate in the Countess's room so that Horner had to come and repair it. You knew that Horner had had a part in a robbery before, so that he would be blamed for this one. Then, when Horner had finished repairing the grate, He called the police, and the unfortunate man was arrested. You then...
Ryder threw himself onto the rug and held on to Holmes's knees.
For God's sake, have mercy! Think of my father! Think of Mother! It would break their hearts!
Get back into your chair,
said Holmes sternly.
It is easy to say that now, but you did not think of this poor Horner before.
I will go away, Mr. Holmes, and without my testimony, Horner will be free.
We will talk about that next,
said Holmes.
And now tell us how the blue carbuncle came into the goose, and how the goose came into the open market. Tell us the truth, because that is your only chance not to go to prison.
Ryder moved his tongue over his dry lips and began his story.
I will tell you exactly what happened. After I had the blue carbuncle, I was terrified. I did not know where to go. I thought I saw the police everywhere. Finally, I decided to go to my sister's. My sister married a man called Oakshott and lives on Brixton Road, where she fattens geese for the market. When I arrived, she asked me what was wrong. I told her that I was upset about the robbery at the hotel. I then went out into the backyard where the geese are and smoked a pipe. I had a friend called Maudsley who had been in prison. He had told me how thieves sold stolen property, so I decided to go to him with the blue carbuncle. However, I did not know how I could carry the blue carbuncle to his house. Then I had the idea to force one of the geese to swallow the stone. My sister had told me that I could have one of the geese for Christmas. So I caught one of the geese, a big white one with a barred tail, and forced open its beak and pushed the stone in with my finger. The goose then swallowed the stone. Then I told my sister that I wanted my Christmas goose then. She thought it was a bit strange, but in the end she said I could have the goose. Unfortunately, while I was talking to my sister, the goose escaped and went in the middle of the flock with the other geese. I caught it again, killed it, and took it to my friend Maudsley. I told him the story. We then cut open the goose, but we could not find the stone. I ran back to my sister and asked her if there were any other white geese with barred tails. She said that there were 2 other ones, but she had sold them to the dealer called Breckenridge of Covent Garden. I went to him and he told me that he had sold them all. You heard him tonight. Now I will be considered a thief, and I have not even touched the blue carbuncle. God help me!
There was a moment of silence, and then Holmes got up and opened the door.
Get out!
Shouted Holmes.
What, sir? Oh, thank you!
Cried Ryder.
No more words. Get out!
And there were no more words. Ryder ran out of the room and out of the house.
After all, Watson,
said Holmes, reaching for his pipe,
if the police can't catch their own criminals, I don't have to do it for them. Also, this Ryder will never commit another crime again. He is too frightened. Besides, this is the season of forgiveness. Chance has given us an incredibly interesting little problem, and its solution should satisfy us. And now, Doctor, we shall begin another investigation, in which a bird is also the most important part. Our dinner.
Almost 2 years have passed since that terrible day. I never wanted to speak about it again, but I feel it is my responsibility to describe the events leading up to it. A certain Colonel Moriarty, a brother of Professor James Moriarty, is responsible for rumours and lies about the character of my dear friend Sherlock Holmes that I will not repeat here. I am the only one who knows what happened between Sherlock Holmes and Professor Moriarty, and it is time that the world knew the truth. I still visited 221B Baker Street from time to time when Holmes wanted a companion to help him with his investigations, but not as often as before. In the final year of my visits, Holmes spent more and more time alone. The mystery he was trying to solve occupied a lot of his time, but he wouldn't speak about it, not even to me. One day, in early spring, I received a letter from France.
Dear Watson, I am working in France for the French government on an important matter that will take me many months to solve. The weather is good, but the food is not so good. I hope all is well with the surgery. I will write again soon. Sherlock Holmes.
From the letter, it seemed clear that I would not see him for some time, so you can imagine my surprise when only a month later he appeared at the window of my surgery. He looked pale and very worried. He entered at a door around the side.
I know what you're thinking,
he said before I could speak.
I look terrible.
I watched as Holmes went around the room making sure all the windows were locked. He closed the blinds. Holmes, what's the matter? I asked.
Air guns,
he replied. Air guns?
I think you know me by now,
he continued.
I am not a nervous man, but there's a difference between stupidity and courage. And when someone is trying to kill me, I don't want them to have a clear shot through your windows. Do you have anything to drink?
I gave him a glass of water. He checked the windows again.
I'm sorry for coming here so late. I won't stay long. I think it's best if I leave over the wall at the back,
he said. Holmes, please explain what all this is about. He said nothing. I looked at his hand. It was bleeding. I offered him something to clean it with. Holmes, this isn't a little fight. Look at your hand.
Are you alone here in the surgery?
He asked. Yes, I am now. There is another doctor who helps me during the week.
Maybe he can help while you're away. I want you to come with me on a trip to Europe. I'm not sure of the exact location. We can decide when we get there.
Holmes's behavior was very strange. He never went on holiday. He certainly didn't go on trips for no reason. He saw the worried look in my eyes.
There's only one person I can trust with this information, Watson, and that's you. For the first time in my life,
he said,
I have finally met my equal. His name is known to every criminal in London, but ask anyone in the street, and they'll say they've never heard of him. Professor Moriarty. The man is a genius. He's a criminal mastermind.
Moriarty? A mastermind?
You see?
He laughed.
No one knows the real Moriarty, but I do. The man is responsible for half the crimes in London. I could continue working for the French government. It's a nice life. It's well paid. But I cannot rest until Moriarty is in prison.
Half the crimes in London? I repeated. But if you really believe this, why haven't you asked Scotland Yard to arrest him? Do you have the evidence?
Crimes happen all the time. The criminal is caught. Sometimes they go to prison, then someone pays money and they go free. Sometimes they are never found. The important thing is that the man who controls everything is never caught. No one must ever suspect him.
But what does he do?
Everything and nothing. He is a well-educated university professor and one of the greatest mathematicians in Europe. At the age of 21, he wrote a thesis that was read all over the world. He was offered a job at a university. He worked very hard, but not towards anything good. He moved to London, where he has chosen to use his extraordinary brain for a life of crime. No one knows the criminal world better than I do. For years I have known that there is someone else behind the crimes I investigate. He is like a spider that sits in the center of a very large web. He plans, he sits, and he waits. He makes the threads, and I follow them. In 3 days' time, with my information, they could arrest Moriarty and all his men. But if I take one step in the wrong direction, then all my work counts for nothing. I was sitting in my chair, thinking about a case this morning, when a man walked into my room. I knew him immediately. His forehead was high, his skin was pale, and his shoulders were round from the time spent in his study. His eyes were so dark, I couldn't read the slightest emotion in them. He observed me with simple curiosity, as his head moved from side to side, like a snake.
"You're not as intelligent as I thought,"
he said.
"Don't you know it's dangerous to keep a loaded gun in your pocket?"
I took out the gun that was in my pocket and put it on the table, but I kept my fingers close to it.
"You know who I am,"
he hissed softly. "If you have something to tell me, Professor Moriarty, I am free for around 5 minutes," I replied.
Holmes moved around the room restlessly. "And what happened next?" I asked.
Moriarty asked me if I would continue with my investigations. I told him he already knew the answer.
"Then you know mine,"
he replied. He put his hand in his pocket. I placed my fingers on the gun on the table. But instead of a gun, he took out a notebook and read aloud.
"On the 4th of January, You passed me in the street. On the 23rd of January, you were in my way. In the middle of February, you were causing me problems. By the end of March, I had to change my plans. Now I find, a month later, that you are trying to take my freedom from me. We both know that this cannot continue.
You're right, I said. It won't continue. Give me 3 more days, and it will end.
You're an interesting opponent, Holmes. I don't know what I'd do without you. I'd be quite bored. You're smiling, but I'm telling you the truth. This little game you are playing is too dangerous.
He continued. I'm not afraid of danger. It's part of my profession, I replied.
This is not danger,
he cried.
This is madness. There is a whole organization behind me. Do you think you alone can stop it? There is only one end to this, Holmes. We both know what it is.
I enjoy your company, I replied, but I have an important matter to investigate.
I know every move you make. If you try to destroy me, I will do the same to you,
he said. You are too kind if you think I am capable of destroying you, but I will happily accept my own destruction if I can free the world of you, Moriarty.
Such a pity,
he said as he went out of the door.
But you leave me with no choice.
Moriarty is a man of his word, and he doesn't waste time. On the way here, I almost lost my life 3 times. First, a carriage with 2 horses came towards me at full speed. Fortunately, I jumped from the road just in time. Then, as I was walking around the corner, a stone fell from the top of the town hall. It missed me by the smallest amount. Finally, on the road to your house, a man attacked me. I hit him hard, and he fell over.
I was amazed at the way my friend spoke of these events. He was lucky to be alive, and yet he told his story so calmly.
You can understand now, Watson, why I shouldn't leave by the front door,
he continued. Holmes, you can't go home. You must stay here. Holmes would not listen. He left, as planned, over the back wall, but only after we had made arrangements for the next day.
I'll see you tomorrow morning,
he said.
Take this note. Follow these instructions carefully. Do exactly what it says. Destroy it afterwards.
Where will I meet you? I asked.
I'll see you on the train. The 3rd carriage from the front is reserved.
The next day, I followed Holmes's instructions. I did not take the first cab that arrived outside my door, or the second. I took the 3rd. I gave the cab driver an address to take my luggage to. I got out early, 10 minutes away from the station. I ran around the corner where a horse and carriage was waiting. He didn't ask for my destination. He took me directly to the station. When I arrived, I was just in time for the express train that connects with the ferry to France. I ran as fast as I could, and I saw a porter taking my luggage to a carriage. There was a reserved sign on the window, and I got in. There was a man in the carriage, but it wasn't Holmes. It was a priest. I was confused. Holmes said the carriage was only reserved for us. I sat down and the train left the station. Where was Holmes? After last night's events, I was very worried for my friend's safety. Then the priest spoke.
It's good manners to say, "Good morning, Watson."
Within moments, I realized that Holmes, disguised as a priest, was sitting before me in the carriage.
We must be careful. There's Moriarty now.
He added. I looked out of the window and saw a man running towards the train, shouting angrily at the guard. I could see his large forehead and small dark eyes in the distance. Holmes smiled, sat down, and took out a newspaper. Holmes, this can't continue. Tell the police they have to arrest Moriarty. They can hold him until you have all the evidence they need.
No,
replied Holmes.
there are too many fish in this net, and I intend to catch them all. Now, we must plan what to do next. Moriarty will soon catch the train.
How? I asked. This is the express train. There aren't any faster trains.
Think, Watson.
Sighed Holmes.
Moriarty is as intelligent as I am. Imagine I'm Moriarty. What would I do?
You could hire a private train.
Precisely.
55 minutes later, the train stopped at a station.
Quick,
Said Holmes.
we're getting off here.
What about our bags? I asked.
They'll arrive in Paris, where one of Moriarty's men will wait for us to come and collect them. We won't be there, of course, because we're getting a ferry to Belgium. We'll buy new bags and new clothes on the way.
We jumped off the train. Holmes pulled me to the ground and we hid behind some bags on the platform. I watched as the train left and our own luggage disappeared. At that same moment, another train passed by on another platform, going at full speed. A man looked out of the window. We saw the face of Professor Moriarty.
We guessed his plan,
Said Holmes.
We're lucky. He didn't guess mine.
On the third day of our travels in Europe, Holmes sent a telegram to the police. Later that evening, he received a reply.
I knew it!
He cried. Have they caught Moriarty? I asked. He shook his head.
He has escaped. You should return to England, Watson. Moriarty will try to find me.
No, I said. I'm going to come with you. We discussed the matter for over an hour until Holmes became bored and agreed that I could stay. Holmes decided it was best for us to walk from France into Switzerland with the help of a local guide. One day, after days of walking, we sat down on a pretty area of grass to eat. I looked up and saw a huge rock falling from the top of the mountain towards us. I jumped out of the way and pushed Holmes to one side. I was surprised the guide didn't try to help. He told us coldly that rocks often fell from the mountain. It was wise to be careful. Who's there? I cried. I ran up the hill, but there was no sign of anyone. Holmes decided to change our plans. We took a different route into Switzerland, and we left our guide. Finally, we crossed over the Alps. We arrived at a small village where we rested at the guest house. The owner spoke good English. He knew London well from his time there in one of the city's finest hotels. He told us about the sights in the area.
You really must go and see the Reichenbach Falls,
he said.
They are a beautiful sight at this time of year. You should stay another night.
We said we had no plans to stay longer, and that we would continue to the next village of Rosenlaui. But Holmes agreed that we should see the falls first, as we weren't far away. After more than an hour along a steep, narrow path, we heard the falls. The water from the melted snow from the mountains fell into the depths below with a sound like thunder. The path ended at the waterfall. The only way back was along the same path we came. Smoke seemed to rise from the black rock at the bottom, like a cauldron. I shouted to Holmes, who was at the end of the path. I heard the echo of my voice from the bottom of the falls. We rested on a rock near the falls to admire the view. Soon after, a young Swiss boy came running towards us with a note in his hand.
Herr Doctor,
he shouted to me. He handed me the note. It was written in English. A young English woman is very ill. We think she is dying, but she doesn't speak any German. We need an English doctor to come quickly before it's too late. Holmes agreed he would continue to Rosenlaui with the Swiss boy as a guide. I would find another guide and see him later. I went back down the hill as quickly as I could to see the poor woman. Where's the patient? I asked. I hope she's not worse.
What do you mean?
The guest house owner asked. I handed him the note written on hotel paper. Didn't you write this? I asked.
No,
he said.
This is very strange.
Can you remember anyone asking you for paper?
Not long before you left, a well-educated Englishman came here.
I didn't wait to hear any more, because I knew the rest. When I was coming down the path to the hotel, I remembered seeing a man on the other side of the hill walking up towards the falls. He was tall and thin, and I ran back up the path, but it took longer to go up than to come down. When I arrived, Holmes wasn't there. My worst fear was true. There wasn't a sick English lady. It was all a lie, so that I would leave Holmes. I tried to think what Holmes would do. It didn't take long to find out what happened. The sight of Holmes's walking stick against a rock nearby told me that his journey went no further than the end of the path by the waterfall. There were no footprints returning back towards the path. I could see the torn roots of plants, and finally the mark of a long fingernail in the ground at the edge of the falls. I looked over into the black water beneath, and shouted as loudly as I could, "Holmes!
Sherlock Holmes!
Sherlock Holmes! Came the echo of my own voice. I shouted again, but it was no good. In that cauldron was one of the world's most dangerous criminals, and in my stomach I knew my friend and one of the world's greatest detectives was with him until the end. Then, on the rock next to the walking stick, I saw a small silver case. I picked it up. There was a note inside. It read,
I am grateful to Professor Moriarty for giving me this opportunity to write to you. Now I will finally defeat one of the world's greatest criminals. Tell everyone the news. The police have all the information they need. I have left a file with my brother, Mycroft. I am sorry, Watson, because I know this will be particularly difficult for you, my dear friend. But my disappearance from this world is the price I must pay. Yours truly, Sherlock Holmes.
Then I understood the guide was paid by Moriarty, and Holmes was left alone for the final battle with Moriarty, which ended, so the local police say, with both men falling to their deaths in the falls. The information Holmes left with the police was enough to send most of Moriarty's men to jail, but little was ever said of their leader, which is why I feel it is my duty to speak of it now. I cannot replace the emptiness that has been left in my life. But maybe Holmes was right. His disappearance was the price only a brilliant detective could pay. Sherlock Holmes was, and always will be, the best and wisest man that I have ever known.